So, once again, we've talked about the employment relationship as being characterised by conflicting interests and by the inbuilt tendency towards the expression of conflict. Now, one of the ways in which that conflict has been managed, although some might see this as an expression of conflict in itself, is through what Walton and McKersey called distributive bargaining. So distributive bargaining rests in the recognition that within organisations there are a limited range of resources, and that the parties to the employment relationship will seek to maximise their share of those resources, and that often that may well be a zero-sum game, that for one side to gain advantage, the other side has to suffer a disadvantage, a win-lose type of outcomes. So conflict will exist over particular bargaining issues. You know, the most obvious being for the workforce to gain a pay increase, then the organisation will have less resources to either keep for itself, to use for, to invest, to provide as a dividend to shareholders. They have to give them away, and if they give them away, they haven't got them anymore themselves. So the conflict will exist over individual issues, but the broader relationship within which this bargaining takes place is seen as mutually advantageous, that there is a benefit, a recognised benefit for employer and employees to engage with each other in this way, even though within these particular examples it's unpleasant, it's conflictual, it's not great, but it exists within a broader relationship which is of benefit to both sides, and that those boundaries of mutual benefit, the extent to which more or less we come out of this process having gained something, represents the range of settlement points, the bargaining area within which deals might be struck. Outside of that, exists a dangerous and a scary area that Walton and McKersey call the default position. That in these scenarios, one side or the other may insist on outcomes which are beyond the fixed amount that's available, that lead to mutual losses, where both sides lose, a strike, or maybe even a permanent breakdown of the relationship. So the skill of the bargainer under distributive bargaining is to maximise the position of the principles that they represent within this area constrained by bargaining limits. They don't want to fall into the default position, because in those areas both sides will typically lose out. So because of that, the behaviour of bargainers under distributive bargaining is a complex game of cat and mouse. It's a complex game of brinkmanship. It's not simply the case that we can read off the behaviour of one side of the negotiation or the other by attempting to understand what they're doing simply on the basis of, well, they're trying to maximise the outcomes for their side. They're trying to optimise the outcome to a certain extent. There are always trade-offs involved. So, for example, a union bargainer may be very successful in raising the wages of for their members, but the trade-off might be that the organisation finds itself in a more tricky competitive situation because of that increase in wages, and so subsequently has to reduce staffing, that jobs may be cut as a result of the pay increase. Now, union negotiators will be aware of this and the trade-offs that are involved, that a wage increase may result in job losses, and they will seek to optimise in a different way. And the nearer that bargainers get to their upper limit of where bargaining remains mutually advantageous, the more marked those trade-offs become. So as we approach the point at which one side or the other can go no further, then the disadvantages for the successful bargainer become more extreme. If we breach those limits, then we observe a very stark discontinuity. We fall off a cliff as bargainers in terms of the outcomes. It may be that we, as a if a union pushes an organisation too far, it may be that the organisation either closes down because it simply can't afford to continue, it becomes completely uncompetitive, or it may relocate. It may just completely breach the employment relationship and seek a new workforce. It may be that, on the other hand, if an organisation pushes the workforce too far, that they find that the workforce no longer wishes to work. They can't recruit, they can't retain their employees, and the organisation becomes untenable as a going concern. So we set out our position in terms of trying to identify the bargaining limits within distributed bargaining, being aware of these various boundaries. The upper and lower bounds, these are the points at which either the employees would quit the company, or the point at which the company would be forced to either shut down or move. Within those upper and lower limits, there are other more realistic boundaries beyond which bargainers are unwilling to go. Now, these are not as extreme as those outer limits, but they represent the real boundaries for a negotiation, because these are boundaries that place limits on them as bargainers. At the lower end, a point beyond which employees would not see any point in having this bargainer to act on their behalf. They would lose all legitimacy on behalf of the workforce. At the other end, the point beyond which the settlement looks so unacceptable to the organisation that management are seen as incompetent to represent the interests of the organisation, that they would be replaced as bargaining agents. So it's these inner boundaries, the limits between which the bargaining agents have to demonstrate their credibility to the principles that they represent. Now, within those boundaries, there are all kinds of potential settlement points, and each one of those settlement points will have relative usefulness, relative utility for each side. And working out where the ultimate settlement point is going to be is complex, because it represents a subjective reading of how useful or how much utility each one of those settlements might have for each side, and the probability of achieving those outcomes, and the cost of achieving those outcomes, just how much pain is going to have to be suffered in order to achieve the outcome, and whether the pain is worth the gain. So we have to go through, as negotiators, we start to plan, scenario plan, where we might wish to settle, what the utility of each settlement point might be for us. Now, that won't simply be a straight line in most circumstances. You might think, for a union negotiator, if we get a low pay settlement, then that has a relatively low utility, and if we get a high pay settlement, we get a high utility, and we can simply join the two together. But that's not the case, because, as we see, that might have an effect on employment levels. It might be that, as a union negotiator, we negotiate in a variety of different workplaces. And so if we settle too high in one negotiation, we raise expectations for subsequent negotiations that maybe we can't achieve in that workplace. And we simply raise the cost of dissatisfaction on our own side. as a management negotiator, we might think that settling high for a pay claim would represent a relatively low utility, and settling low just provides benefits. And again, a straight line will join the two. But it won't be the case because, for example, an organisation may need to maintain wages at a certain level within a labour market in order to retain or to have the continued motivation or productivity of key groups of staff. And if they're too successful in maintaining a low wage settlement, that results in bad outcomes, low usefulness, low utility. So we need to have a sophisticated view about what the subjective utility of various settlement points might be, and to scenario plan, not just for our side, but what we think the other side might be thinking about their settlement points and the utility of those settlements for them as well, so that we can start to plan what the response of our bargaining opponents might be, and therefore how we can strategize around the way in which we kind of move the negotiation into areas which are helpful for us. Outside of these boundaries, as I say, lie potential costs. Strike costs, for particular example, lost production for the employer, lost wages for employees. Costs on both sides. We want to try to avoid that as a bargainer. Now, the calculation of what the relative impact of these costs might be where negotiations fail will again have a big influence on the perceptions of what the range of possible settlement points might be. If the cost of attaining an extra few pence on a pay increase, if that calculation is that the cost will be very high to secure a small increase, then it may be deemed as simply not worth it. And so the calculation of what we should be aiming for as negotiation aims and what our ideal settlement points should be include not just a calculation of the utility of the settlement point itself, but how much it costs us to get there.